It's known as the Union's most infamous POW camp, and it was located right here in the Greater Western New York region. Welcome to today's show of the State of Greater Western New York Report. We're here every Wednesday, every Thursday at noon. That's what you get for not having a script writer. But anyways, we're here now, the State of Greater Western New York Report, and it's brought to you by... Each week, our community makes history. Each week, you make history. And each week, there's only one source to turn to for the first take on history. You know what that is? Subscribe to the Sentinel right now to discover the history being made in your own backyard. The Mendon Honeylight Falls Lima Sentinel. More than just your news, it's your history. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. Join us each episode as we discuss fantastic topics ranging from history to science to the strange and the wonderful, as well as the treasured spirit with which our region has infused America. We challenge you to consider all things Greater Western New York, from our region's very beginnings to how it inspires, how it empowers, and why it is so admired. Here's the host of the State of Greater Western New York Report, Chris Carosa. Hi there, and welcome everyone to this week's version of the State of Greater Western New York Report. I'm Chris Carosa. Today with me, we've got a very fascinating guest, extremely interesting. He's a historian. He's an associate professor out of the Genesee Community College, right now in Batavia, although he has worked in the Lima version too. But he's all over. He lives right outside of Rochester, and he knows a little bit about history. It's Derek Maxfield, sorry. I knew I was going to do that. Derek, how are we doing today?
I'm doing great, thank you.
So Derek, tell us a little bit about your background. What got you interested in history, and maybe what got you a little bit interested in Western New York history at least, and how'd you end up where you ended up?
Well, that's quite a few questions there. Let me do my best. So I've always been interested in history. I remember going back to my boyhood in Campbell, New York, borrowing National Geographic history books from my great uncle, including a volume on the Civil War that I paged through, and I was always borrowing it. So I recognized that from a fairly young age, but I never really considered it as a career. My first career was in journalism and radio. I was a radio personality for about 10 years and wrote for various newspapers. And I thought that was the trajectory that I was on. I went back to college kind of late at SUNY Cortland, and there I met a professor named Ellis Johnson, who at first I was petrified of, just so scared of. But one day after class we sat on a bench and we talked for 3 hours, and I was hooked. Not just with him, but on history, and that's where it all started. I'm originally from Dundee. My younger years were in Campbell, but so the Southern Tier in Western New York. I went to school at SUNY Cortland first, and my graduate experience was at Villanova University, and then back to Western New York to the University of Buffalo.
That's great. I mean, so you're really Western New York through and through, but your interest in history seems to be centered in the 19th century. That's the 1800s, for those of you who are keeping score at home, and especially the Victorian era. I mean, this is kind of cool, what I think. So you mentioned something in your bio about Victorian deathways. What the heck are Victorian deathways?
Well, it is true. I live in the 19th century, and perhaps I better belong there. I don't know. I just always fell back into the 19th century with my interests. I remember early in college being interested in, the early republic. So the creation of the Constitution and the early presidents. So that's kind of the early end. And then when I was in grad school, I was doing a lot of work in the Gilded Age, which is on the back end. But the Civil War has always been at the very center, and I always end up back in the Civil War. But the Victorian deathways thing is just something that I discovered walking through a cemetery. So I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but with some cemeteries, you walk in and you look to your left and you see all these magnificent old stones, highly decorated and ornate, and lots of obelisks and just fantastic looking monuments. And then you look to the right and you see the 20th century gravestones, and they all look the same. They're all like rectangular and close to the ground, and not very ornate or decorative, and I'm like, what's the story here? Why in the 19th century did the Victorians celebrate life and death with these magnificent monuments, and then we changed our attitudes so that we just have these very plain granite monuments? What happened here? So that's where it all originated, and then as I investigated that, I just was more and more fascinated in the various ways that the Victorians marked death. In some ways, they were kind of obsessed with it. And so their funeral rites and the fashion that they chose to wear in and around funerals, and just all of their practices surrounding death, I have found utterly fascinating.
Well, let's talk about something a little bit more joyful. Pop culture. Pop culture in the 19th century. Well, I'm calling it pop culture. You might not call it pop culture. But, hey, what was the culture like in that era, particularly in America? That's kind of what we're interested in here. Maybe a little bit about Western New York, but what sticks out to you with regards to that?
Well, the Victorians were the drivers of culture in the 19th century. They were the ones that largely kind of made the social rules and the social mores of the time. And so we're talking about middle class, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants largely. And, if you were in the working class, you would have to react to them. If you were the rich, you wanted to separate yourself from them. But the Victorians were the ones that kind of made all the rules. And it was infused by this morality that came out of the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening was an evangelical revival movement centered in Western New York. That corridor between Rochester and Buffalo, historians call the burned over district. This revival movement infused the Victorians with the sense of reform. They thought they could bring about the second coming of Christ by perfecting this world. And so all these reform movements were started, driven by Victorian women largely. And so we're talking about temperance reform, reform of prisons, the women's rights movement, the abolitionist movement, all of these driven by this new sense of morality that the Victorians adopt. One of the things I find most fascinating about Victorians is that they're very materialistic. And as the course of the century goes on, they become insatiably materialistic. And this is reflected in the cemetery art, but it's also reflected in their buying patterns. As the consumer revolution takes off in the late 19th century, you get the beginning of department stores, and it becomes this arms race of material goods. The whole saying, keep up with the Joneses, originates with this competition among Victorians to buy.
Buy. The government or politics, how did that kind of shape politics? You sort of hinted at the reform movement, but and I think a lot of the reform, say, maybe really culminated in the second half of the 19th century, but it was growing before then, and it really led to this kind of political divisiveness that we saw ending up as the war between the states, as some people say. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about the political evolution and maybe some of how Western New York may have influenced national politics.
Well, the political landscape in America changes dramatically over the course of the 19th century. When we look just at the presidents, for example, the model of who can become president and why changes kind of dramatically. The pivot point is Andrew Jackson. If you look at the presidents before Andrew Jackson, they are, rich white guys. They have either been Secretary of State or Vice President. They are highly educated, usually. Andrew Jackson was the first kind of populist president elected democratically, and it changes who we elect after Andrew Jackson. leading down to the Civil War. There's a lot of people that can't name a president between Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln, and it's largely because the politics of the time emphasized the prerogatives of Congress leading down to the war. After the Civil War, we entered the most corrupt period in American politics, which is hard to believe when you consider today, but it was so divisive and so corrupt. You had senators taking bribes out in the street in the open air, and people used to brag that they had a senator in their pocket. They were on the payroll of these big companies, and the corruption was just so widespread. This was the era of the political machines, of course. Western New York and New York State certainly played a role in this. New York City had a big political machine, of course, Tammany Hall. Buffalo had a very powerful political machine in the late 19th century. And some prominent figures come out of Western New York. Probably, and to my mind, the most significant was William Seward. Seward, for a time, was governor of New York State senator, and he becomes Secretary of State to Abraham Lincoln, and plays a very important role in Lincoln's administration during the Civil War.
Sometimes you end a little bit faster for me, but that's all right. So let's go up to the Civil War now in terms of what was the world like right before the war? And when I say world, I mean, what was America like? What was Western New York like? What were the things that really triggered? What was the spark that kind of pushed people over the edge to have what in essence started off as almost a Sunday afternoon picnic game, the Civil War? Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, how people were like spectators watching a game in the first battle outside of Washington, D.C. But
right, the Battle of Bull Run.
Right. Tell us a little bit about that. What led up to that?
Well, the 1850s were such a turbulent period, and the tension between North and South over the expansion of slavery had nearly triggered a war in 1850 after the war with Mexico and all the land we acquired from them. It could have happened then, but there was a big political compromise called the Compromise of 1850 that basically just kicked the can down the road for 10 years. But the 1850s, just was a period where the heat just kept getting turned up more and more and more, and the divisiveness between North and South worse and worse. And there's a number of flashpoints. I can think of, the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the controversy over a slave or a free government in Kansas. There was, the Dred Scott decision, a Supreme Court decision that ruled that an African American was not a citizen, therefore could not sue in federal court. He was trying to get his freedom. But probably the big one in the 1850s was the Harper's Ferry raid by John Brown. It was an attempt by John Brown to start a slave insurrection in Virginia. It failed miserably. Interestingly, the man that put down John Brown's raid was Robert E. Lee, who will later be a famous commander in the Confederate Army. But the straw that you're talking about was the election of Lincoln in 1860. Southerners just saw a Republican elected president as kind of the more than they could take. They presumed that all Republicans were abolitionists, and the northern people were more or less in charge of the branches of government, and they had just had enough, and they wanted to go on their own way.
All right. Well, we'll learn a little bit more about what happens next and the role that Western New York played, at least when it came to POW camps. You're listening to the State of Greater Western New York Report. You're also watching it, hopefully, and we'll be right back after this message. Through the mists of time, nature and man have both created and buried treasures beyond the imagination. With the ages, these riches slowly dissolve into mere myths, till they are forever forgotten. But there are those brave souls who tirelessly cling to the truth, ever seeking to discover the undiscovered, to reveal what has always been there, to uncover the hidden gems of a land thought forsaken but loved by millions. 50 Hidden Gems of Greater Western New York. Discover the secrets in your own backyard. Buy your copy now at 50hiddengems.com. Welcome back to the State of Greater Western New York Report. I'm Chris Carosa, your host, and with us today is Derek Maxfield, an Associate Professor of History at Genesee Community College. And Derek, you wrote a book.
I did.
And it's about this infamous POW camp in the town of Elmira, or the city of Elmira. I don't know if it was a town or a city back then. You can tell us, what prompted you to go into this particular field? Has anybody written about it before, or is this kind of like new terrain?
Well, it's new terrain in that there's not a lot of people out there writing about Civil War prisoner of war camps. So it is kind of a hidden story. My interest was largely about the myths and the stories I had heard. I grew up only 35 miles from Elmira, and I never knew that there was a POW camp there during the Civil War, because the community had erased all traces of it. They didn't want it to be remembered, honestly, and that was because there were atrocities committed there by the Union, and there was a lot of suffering, and it could have been avoided. And at the end of the Civil War, the Elmira POW camp was being compared to Andersonville. And Andersonville was a Confederate-run POW camp in southern Georgia, where atrocity is hardly the word to use here. Atrocity in all cap letters. The suffering there was just unimaginable. I could not wrap my head around the fact that this had existed, because there's just no traces of it, you know. And the project was not actually one I intended to make into a book. I was writing a post for Emerging Civil War, which is an online journal I've written for years and really enjoy. And I just wrote a couple blog posts about the POW camp in Elmira. And the editor of Emerging Civil War, Chris Mikowski, said, well, how about writing a book? Would you write a book for us? We'll publish it. Well, you know, when a publisher says we'll publish a book for you, you don't turn them down. And so I agreed to take on the project. So my interest had been largely kind of incidental, because I was curious. But then the project was upon me, and I had to go in search of the facts. There are a couple of books, you know, but they're 25 years old, you know, and so there's not a really recent treatment. And what I was charged with doing was writing an introductory book, you know. So the books that are out there are more comprehensive, you know, they're much longer books. But what I'm trying to do is spur interest, you know,
right,
with a small introductory treatment, and say, hey, you know, this is readable, I hope. And I hope I've made it interesting. And if you want to learn more, you can look to these other books.
right. And there's a question that we have, and it's based on what you just said, how there's no trace of this POW camp anymore. How did you go about doing the research? How did you find something that was, it appears to be maybe erased from the annals of history? Where did you find your source information?
So first of all, I was aware of a couple of books as I said, from about 25 years ago, one by Michael Horrigan, one by Michael Gray. And so those were out there. And, I got my hands on those and I was fascinated by what I saw. But, I also then went back to the primary sources. And so you can look at the correspondence between those people running the camp. You find those in the official records of the Civil War, memoirs of the participants, and there's quite a few memoirs of the men who were incarcerated in Elmira. As you'd expect, they're all filled with vitriol and hate over the experience, justifiable, some of it. So there's not really a shortage of primary sources that you can use, if you go out there digging. Some of the memoirs are just utterly fascinating. There was one memoir written by Anthony Kiley, who was actually a Virginia legislator that was in the wrong place at the wrong time and got captured. And he was one of the few that was not just a regular foot soldier from Lee's army that ended up in Elmira, an educated gentleman. He was probably the only one. But he wrote a memoir called Inviculus. It's just utterly fascinating.
So this is sort of similar to what a lot of historians have done with Sullivan's March, where they go and get the actual diary pages, if you will, of the soldiers involved. In this case, it's the prisoners and the people running the camp. When
Yep.
You mentioned the vitriol, and the Civil War was very, very harsh indeed. But the one thing that I think people came away with it after the war, how long did this hatred stay, or what was done to sort of reunify the country after the war? I mean, I understand it may have taken a generation or so, but certainly by the early 1900s, the Union soldiers and the Confederate soldiers were marching hand in hand, to celebrate whatever it is they're celebrating, honoring themselves, who knows what. But by that time, it was fine. So what happened? How did that unification come back to be?
Well, that's a long and complicated story. So immediately after the war ended, of course, the South was feeling humiliated. They were feeling, really bad that they had to surrender. Once Lee surrendered, more or less all hope was given up. And putting the country back together was Lincoln thought was going to be his job, but of course he's assassinated. It was not easy, and the part of what complicated things was military reconstruction in the South between 1867 and 1877 that engendered deep bitterness and resentment in the Southern people. The radical Republicans that were in control of Congress at the time wanted to punish the South. That was their agenda: punish the South for treason, And so the military occupation of the South, the abolition of all Southern governments and all civil authority was replaced by martial law for those 10 years. And the rights of the Southern people just trampled. And so it's no wonder that they come out of Reconstruction feeling bitter and resentful, something that Lincoln himself was trying desperately to avoid. So far as reconciliation, this is overplayed, really. I would point to a wonderful book by Brian Matthew Jordan called Marching Home. It's one of my favorite recent books, and it demonstrates how Union soldiers, after they went home, really were not all that interested in reconciliation. And the moments that you see, like the Gettysburg reunion early in the 20th century, represents a small portion of the total number of Union veterans. The reconciliation story was something that the government wanted to push, and those interested parties wanted to push, but I really think it's overplayed. It's a complicated story, and the fact that the South started to create a new narrative we refer to it now as the lost cause mythology, really began to dominate our discussions of what the war was all about. And so the idea that Lee was this paragon and, a great model, and, they began to nearly worship people like Lee and Stonewall Jackson. And the story became, the war wasn't about slavery after all. It was about Southern independence. And this glorious cause was only squashed by overwhelming power by the Union that recklessly and relentlessly waged war on civilians, women, and children. This lost cause story came to dominate the discussion over reconciliation and what the meaning of the war really was, to the extent where, down to today, it has had such power over the imagination of people. Just anecdotally, I started during the sesquicentennial of the Civil War working with reenactors in Western New York, during doing these battle reenactments and stuff. And I was intrigued to find that most reenactors in Western New York were Confederate. Sometimes there were so many Confederates and so few Union soldiers that some Confederate soldiers had to put on blue jackets and take off their gray jackets to more even the numbers for these reenactments. And so the question is, if New York State furnished more soldiers to the Union Army than any other state in the Union, why are so many of their great-grandsons Confederate reenactors? And the answer is the lost cause mythology has dominated the way that we have thought about the war, and even Western New Yorkers with ancestors in the Union Army are attached to the romance of the lost cause.
Well, you are aware, of course, that the last municipality to rejoin the Union after the Civil War was located right outside of the city of Buffalo.
Yes.
Well, that's kind of a weird story. It's not totally as it sounds, because they never really seceded. But they said they seceded. I don't know. It's right. It's an interesting story. It's a Town Line. Town Line is the name of the. Yeah. It's a hamlet. It's not even a real municipality. But so, Derek, tell us about what's going on Monday. You're going to do a presentation on the book. Where is it? When is it? And how can people go?
Well, I'll tell you, it's been a long wait to do book events because of the pandemic. My book came out right in the middle of the pandemic, and so I've been unable to do a lot of public events. So I'm so happy to do a face-to-face event back at Genesee Community College here in Batavia. It's going to be in the Connable Technology Building next Monday, the 18th at 7 p.m. We'll have copies of the book for sale, and I'll be happy to sign them. So I'll be giving a talk about POW camps in general and Elmira in particular. I'll be joined by my colleague Michael Goslin, who wrote an appendix for the book about Mark Twain and Elmira. So I'm happy that he'll be joining me. The event will probably be between an hour and a half. It's free and open to the public. No need to register or anything. Just come on down.
All right. Thank you very much, Derek. And thank you for being on the show today. Very, very interesting. Wondering if you're going to maybe also talk about the POW camp that was, where was it? In Letchworth or somewhere around there? That
You mean the World War II camp?
The World War II camp, yeah. Yeah.
I probably won't be talking about that, but I will foreshadow my new book.
Okay.
So I have a book coming out in the spring. It's a biography of William Tecumseh Sherman, who was a Civil War general. Something that is kind of a labor of love. So that's coming out in the spring. I'm happy about that, and I will probably plug that too.
Well, just come on back and we'll plug it. Are you going to be talking about his visit to the greater Western New York region when they reinterred the bodies of Thomas Boyd and I can't remember the other guy, Parker, from the Sullivan campaign?
Well, Sherman made a lot of visits to New York, and he ended his days in Manhattan. He was a frequent speaker on the lecture circuit after the Civil War, and so was in Buffalo and Rochester for reunions all the time.
Oh, wow. That's great. That'll be a very interesting book, and quite an interesting character. Well, Derek, thank you very much for appearing on today's show. Audience, thank you for being here live and asking your questions. If you'd like to ask a question, just feel free to go to stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com and sign up to be an audience member. It's free and you are invited. It's a private invitation, so you have to sign up in order to get the invitation. But once you're on the list, you're on it. You'll always be invited, and you can come and ask questions, all the questions that you want. So that's it for today. Remember, we're here every Thursday at noon, live. The show's archived on our site, stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com. And it's also re-aired on our YouTube and Facebook channels Sunday at 1:30. So again, the Bills are playing on Monday night, so you won't be missing anything of import. So once again, thank you for watching the show, and we'll see you next week.